Hey everyone! Tonight we're diving into one of ancient history's most controversial and misunderstood institutions, the world of temple prostitutes in ancient Mesopotamia. Women who served in what many believed were sacred sexual rites, but whose reality was far grimmer than any religious text would have you believe. Before we begin this journey into the shadows of the ancient world, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you genuinely find value in these deep dives into history's forgotten corners. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see our community spanning the globe, united by curiosity about the past. Picture this. It's 2100 BCE in the bustling city of Babylon. The ziggurats pierce the sky like ancient skyscrapers, and the streets hum with merchants hawking everything from barley to precious stones. But tucked away in the temple complexes, behind walls adorned with glazed bricks and cuneiform inscriptions, exists a world that modern scholars are still trying to understand. A world where young women found themselves caught between divine duty and human exploitation. You've probably heard the stories. Greek historians like Herodotus wrote breathlessly about Babylonian customs that seemed scandalous to foreign eyes. Tales of every woman being required to serve in the temple of Ishtar, of sacred prostitution as a religious obligation, of fertility rites that shocked even the cosmopolitan Greeks. But here's the thing about ancient sources, especially ones written by outsiders looking in. They often tell us more about the prejudices of the storyteller than the reality of the people they're describing. Modern archaeologists and historians have spent decades sifting through thousands of cuneiform tablets, temple records, and legal documents. What they've found paints a picture far more complex and disturbing than the sensationalized accounts of ancient tourists. Because when you strip away the religious justifications and the exotic mystique, what emerges is a system that trapped women in cycles of economic desperation and social marginalization that would make your skin crawl. The truth is, we're dealing with a society where survival itself was a daily struggle. Mesopotamia, despite its reputation as the cradle of civilization, was a harsh land where failed harvests meant starvation, where warfare was constant, and where women had precious few options for economic independence. In this environment, temples weren't just houses of worship. They were economic powerhouses, controlling vast amounts of land, livestock, and trade. They needed workers. And unfortunately, some of those workers were women whose bodies became commodities in a religious marketplace. Now, before we go further, let's address the elephant in the room. Did temple prostitution actually exist as described in popular imagination? The honest answer is that scholars are deeply divided. Some argue that the entire concept is based on misunderstandings and mistranslations of ancient texts. Others point to administrative records that seem to document women working in temple complexes in roles that involved sexual services. What everyone agrees on is that the romantic notion of empowered priestesses celebrating fertility through sacred sexuality is almost certainly fantasy. What we're really talking about are women, many of them slaves or from the lowest social classes, who found themselves in temple complexes not as honored servants of the goddess, but as workers in an institution that had very earthly concerns about profit and power. These weren't mystical ceremonies conducted by willing participants basking in divine favor. These were economic transactions conducted in cramped rooms behind temple walls, involving women who had little choice in their circumstances and even less control over their lives. Let's start with how someone became a temple prostitute in the first place. Because contrary to popular belief, this wasn't typically a calling or a chosen profession. Most women ended up in these roles through a combination of economic desperation, family decisions made for them, or outright coercion. In a society where daughters were often seen as economic burdens, families facing hardship might dedicate a girl to temple service. It sounds noble when you frame it as religious devotion, but the reality was often much more pragmatic and heartless. Imagine being 10 years old and having your parents explain that you've been chosen by the goddess Inanna for special service. They dress it up in religious language, talk about divine favor and sacred duty. But what they're really doing is solving a family economic problem by transferring responsibility for your care to the temple. You're too young to understand that you're essentially being sold, that your childhood is ending, and that the life stretching ahead of you will be defined by the needs and desires of men you'll never choose to meet. The temple complexes themselves were vast institutions employing hundreds of people in various capacities. There were high priestesses who wielded real political power, scribes who managed the complex accounting systems, craftsmen who created the beautiful objects used in ceremonies, and farmers who worked the temple lands. But at the bottom of this hierarchy were women whose primary value lay in their bodies and their inability to say no. The living conditions for these women were a far cry from the luxury we might imagine surrounded religious service. Archaeological evidence from temple sites reveals small, cramped rooms with low benches, spaces that prioritized function over comfort. These weren't chambers designed for sacred rituals conducted with dignity and reverence. These were utilitarian spaces where transactions happened quickly and efficiently, with little regard for the humanity of the women involved. Daily life would have followed a grinding routine dictated by the needs of the temple economy. Unlike the high priestesses who participated in major religious ceremonies and wielded influence in city politics, women in prostitution roles were relegated to the shadows of temple life. They would have risen before dawn, prepared themselves according to whatever standards were demanded, and then waited for clients who might be merchants passing through the city, local officials conducting business with the temple, or even fellow temple workers seeking services. The economic structure of this system reveals its true nature. Administrative tablets from temple complexes show that women in these roles received standard rations, like other temple workers. But unlike craftsmen or farmers who could potentially accumulate property or improve their status, women in prostitution were trapped in a cycle where their earnings went to the temple or to owners if they were slaves. They had no path to financial independence, no ability to save for their future, and no prospect of changing their circumstances through their own efforts. The social stigma attached to this work was crushing and permanent. Mesopotamian law codes, particularly the Middle Assyrian laws, created a system of visual identification that marked these women as social outcasts. While respectable women were required to veil themselves in public, prostitutes were forbidden from covering their heads. This wasn't just about modesty or religious observance. It was a form of social branding that made it impossible for these women to move through society without immediately advertising their profession and their low status. Think about what this means in practical terms. Every time you left the temple complex, every interaction with merchants in the market, every encounter with neighbors or officials, you were immediately identified as someone whose body was for sale. There was no escape from this identity, no possibility of reinventing yourself or starting fresh somewhere else. The unveiled head was a permanent advertisement of your social position and an invitation for harassment, discrimination, and abuse. The legal system offered these women virtually no protection. In fact, it actively worked against them. If a man saw a prostitute wearing a veil and failed to report her to authorities, he could face severe punishment. This created a society where citizens were incentivized to police and humiliate women in prostitution, where any attempt to claim respectability or dignity was literally illegal. The law didn't just permit discrimination against these women, it required it. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all was the complete lack of agency these women had over their own bodies and lives. Unlike even slaves in other occupations who might have some predictability in their work or the possibility of eventual freedom, women in temple prostitution existed in a state of constant uncertainty. They never knew who their next client would be, what would be demanded of them, or whether they would face violence or abuse with no recourse to justice. The religious justifications that supposedly elevated this work above mere prostitution were largely meaningless in daily practice. Yes, the goddess Inanna was associated with sexuality and fertility. Yes, there were mythological stories about sacred marriages and divine unions. But for the women actually living this reality, these religious frameworks provided no protection, no dignity, and no power. They were simply another form of control, a way of making exploitation seem divinely ordained rather than systemically cruel. The clients who visited these women came from all walks of life, but they shared one thing in common. They held all the power in these transactions. Whether they were wealthy merchants, temple officials, or local craftsmen, they could demand services, set terms, and leave without consequence. For the women, each encounter was a reminder of their powerlessness, their inability to choose their partners, their work conditions, or even their basic safety. As we delve deeper into this world, what becomes clear is that temple prostitution in ancient Mesopotamia wasn't about sacred sexuality or divine empowerment. It was about economic exploitation wrapped in religious language, about women trapped in a system that commodified their bodies while denying them basic human dignity. The temples may have been houses of the gods, but for these women, they were prisons decorated with religious art and justified by sacred texts. The more we examine the evidence, the more apparent it becomes that this institution thrived not because it served any genuine religious purpose, but because it solved economic problems for temples, families, and a society that saw women as disposable resources rather than human beings deserving of choice and dignity. And then there were the hierarchies within the system itself, because even among women trapped in this institution, there were levels of misery that would make Dante weep. At the top, if you could call it that, were women who served in the main temple complexes, those grand ziggurats that dominated city skylines. These women at least had the protection of walls, regular meals, and some semblance of structure, but below them existed a shadow economy that makes your blood run cold. The tavern workers had it worst of all. Picture this. You're not even afforded the dubious dignity of temple walls. Instead, you're stationed in drinking establishments that operated on the absolute margins of society. These weren't cozy neighborhood pubs where everyone knows your name. These were rough, dangerous places where alcohol flowed freely, inhibitions disappeared, and violence was as common as spilled beer on sticky floors. The connection between taverns and prostitution wasn't coincidental. It was strategic. Tavern owners discovered early that offering women's services alongside barley beer was a profitable combination. And the goddess Inanna, conveniently enough, was said to patronize these establishments. How convenient for business owners looking to justify their human trafficking operations with religious window dressing. Working in a tavern meant dealing with clients who were drunk, unpredictable, and often violent. There were no temple officials nearby to maintain even the pretense of order. No religious ceremonies to add dignity to the transactions. Just you, a cramped back room, and whoever stumbled in with enough copper pieces to buy your time. The tavern keeper took their cut, the client took what they wanted, and you survived another day if you were lucky. The credit system made everything worse. Because taverns operated on promises and future payments, women often provided services before receiving compensation. Imagine the anxiety of never knowing if payment would actually materialize. Imagine providing intimate services to strangers on the hope that they'd honor their debts tomorrow, next week, or ever. This system trapped women in cycles of debt and obligation that made escape virtually impossible. And speaking of escape, let's talk about what happened when women tried to improve their circumstances or simply survive the daily grind. The Middle Assyrian laws didn't just require prostitutes to remain unveiled. They created an entire surveillance state where ordinary citizens became enforcers of social hierarchy. Your unveiled head wasn't just a mark of shame. It was an invitation for anyone and everyone to police your behavior, to report violations, to participate in your humiliation. If you dared to cover your head, seeking even a moment's anonymity or dignity, any man who saw you could report you to authorities. And if he failed to report you, he faced punishment himself. This created a society where your degradation became everyone else's civic duty, where attempting basic human dignity was a crime that implicated not just you, but anyone who allowed you to get away with it. The punishments for violations were designed to break both body and spirit. 50 lashes with a whip, hot bitumen poured on your head, public flogging that left scars as permanent reminders of your transgression. These weren't just punishments. They were performances designed to reinforce social order by making examples of women who stepped out of line. But here's where it gets truly diabolical. The system didn't just punish individual violations. It made resistance psychologically impossible by ensuring that any attempt to claim dignity would result in consequences so severe that most women simply internalized their degradation. Better to accept your unveiled status and the harassment it invited than to risk the torture that came with defiance. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest aspect of all. High-ranking priestesses, the Naditim, who served gods like Shamash and Marduk, were explicitly forbidden from associating with prostitutes under penalty of death. Think about that. The very women who might have understood the religious context of temple service, who wielded actual power within these institutions, were legally prohibited from offering support, guidance, or even basic human contact. This created a caste system within temple complexes where women in prostitution were literally untouchable to anyone with social standing. They couldn't form alliances with more powerful women. They couldn't seek mentorship or protection from established religious figures. They existed in complete social quarantine, isolated from anyone who might have helped them navigate or escape their circumstances. The economic exploitation went deeper than simple transaction fees, because remember, many of these women were slaves whose earnings belonged entirely to their owners. Every service provided, every client served, every humiliation endured generated profit that flowed upward to priests, priestesses, or slave owners who never had to face the physical and emotional toll of the work itself. For enslaved women, there was no hope of accumulating savings, no possibility of buying freedom, no path to economic independence. They were human profit centers whose value lay entirely in their ability to generate revenue for others. Their owners had every incentive to maximize that revenue, regardless of the physical or psychological cost to the women themselves. Even free women in these roles found their economic options severely constrained. Administrative records show they received standard grain rations like other temple workers, but unlike craftsmen or scribes who could potentially accumulate property or develop valuable skills, women in prostitution had no transferable expertise except their bodies. And bodies age, bodies wear out. Bodies become less valuable over time, leaving these women with nothing to show for years of service except trauma and social stigma. The married women listed in temple records reveal another layer of desperation. These weren't women choosing prostitution as a career. These were wives and mothers driven by economic necessity to supplement family income through the only means available to them. Imagine the psychological toll of returning home each night to a husband and children after spending your day providing intimate services to strangers. Imagine trying to maintain family relationships while your profession made you a social pariah in your own community. And what about the children born to women in these circumstances? Temple records occasionally mention offspring, but their fate remains largely unknown. Were they raised within temple complexes, sold into slavery themselves, given away to families who could provide for them? The silence in historical records suggests that these children, like their mothers, were considered expendable inconveniences in a system focused on profit rather than human welfare. The religious festivals that supposedly celebrated fertility and divine union must have been particularly cruel for women trapped in this system. Imagine being forced to participate in ceremonies that glorified the very sexuality that had become your prison. Watching wealthy citizens celebrate Inanna's power and sensuality, while you experienced that same sexuality as degradation and exploitation. The festivals weren't celebrations of divine femininity. They were reminders of your powerlessness, dressed up in religious pageantry. The archaeological evidence tells its own story of confined spaces and institutional control. Those small rooms with low benches weren't designed for comfort or dignity. They were designed for efficiency, quick transactions that maximize profit while minimizing the time and space required. The architecture itself reveals how these women were viewed, not as sacred servants deserving respect, but as commodities requiring only the most basic functional accommodations. Climate and geography added their own challenges. Mesopotamian summers were brutally hot, and those cramped temple rooms would have been stifling. Without proper ventilation or cooling, women would have endured physical discomfort on top of everything else. The flooding seasons that periodically devastated Mesopotamian cities would have made conditions even worse, with damp, moldy spaces and disrupted food supplies affecting the most vulnerable members of society first and most severely. The constant threat of violence hung over every interaction. Unlike modern societies with police forces and legal protections for sex workers, ancient Mesopotamia offered these women no recourse when clients became abusive. Temple officials might intervene if violence threatened their property, but individual women's safety was rarely a priority. Clients knew they could act with impunity, that complaints would be dismissed, and that women had no alternative but to endure whatever treatment they received. Disease was another constant companion. In an era before antibiotics or modern hygiene, sexually transmitted infections spread rapidly and could be fatal. Women in prostitution faced these health risks daily while having no access to medical care beyond whatever folk remedies might be available. Pregnancy was equally dangerous, with high maternal mortality rates and no reliable contraception methods. The psychological trauma of this existence is difficult for modern minds to fully comprehend. These women lived in a state of constant objectification, where their humanity was denied and their bodies treated as public resources. They couldn't form meaningful relationships, couldn't plan for the future, couldn't even maintain basic dignity in their daily interactions. The mental health consequences would have been devastating, though ancient societies had no framework for understanding or addressing psychological damage. As political power shifted and empires rose and fell, the conditions for these women often worsened rather than improved. The increasing patriarchal control over women's sexuality that characterized later Mesopotamian periods created new restrictions and stigmas. What might have begun as religious practices with some cultural legitimacy gradually transformed into purely commercial enterprises with no pretense of sacred purpose. The women caught in this system weren't statistics in administrative records or footnotes in religious texts. They were human beings with hopes, fears, dreams, and desires who found themselves trapped in circumstances that denied their basic humanity. Their stories, largely lost to history, represent one of civilization's earliest and most systematic forms of institutionalized exploitation. And tomorrow, when the sun rose over those ancient ziggurats, they would wake up to face it all over again, with no escape in sight and no voice to tell their stories to a world that preferred to look away. The seasonal festivals were the worst part, not because of the extra work, though there was plenty of that. Not because of the crowds, though the temples swelled with pilgrims and merchants and officials all demanding services. No, the festivals were torture because they celebrated everything your life was not. Picture the festival of Inanna's sacred marriage. The entire city would come alive with music, dancing, processions of flower-crowned maidens singing hymns about divine love and fertility. Wealthy women would dress in their finest silks, their heads properly veiled, their children running beside them as they made offerings at the temple steps. The air would fill with the scent of roasted lamb, fresh bread, and expensive incense. Everyone would be celebrating the goddess's power, her sexuality, her divine femininity. And there you'd be, watching from the shadows, your unveiled head marking you as the one person in this celebration of sacred sexuality who couldn't participate in its joy. You were the living embodiment of everything the festival honored, yet you were excluded from its happiness. The irony was so cruel it could drive you mad. They were celebrating the very thing that had destroyed your life. The festival clients were different too. Pilgrims from distant cities, drunk on wine and religious fervor, who saw you not as a person, but as a religious experience. They'd quote prayers while they used your body, convinced they were participating in something holy. Some would weep afterward, overcome by what they believed was divine communion. Others would become violent when the reality failed to match their spiritual expectations. You learned to read the dangerous ones quickly, the men whose religious ecstasy could turn lethal without warning. Then there were the regulars, the local officials who visited monthly, the merchants who timed their business trips to coincide with your availability, the priests who administered the system during the day and participated in it at night. These men knew your name, your preferences, your fears. They'd bring small gifts sometimes, a piece of fruit, a copper bead, as if these tokens could transform exploitation into relationship. Some convinced themselves they were being kind. Others enjoyed the power of knowing they owned pieces of your life. The worst regulars were the ones who wanted to talk. They'd arrive with complaints about their wives, their business troubles, their disappointments. They'd use your body and then expect you to serve as confessor, therapist, friend. You learn intimate details about their families, their hopes, their fears, while knowing that to them you remained a nameless service provider. They'd pour out their hearts to you and then walk past you in the market the next day without acknowledgement. The temple administrators tracked everything with bureaucratic precision that would make a modern accountant weep. How many clients per day? What services were provided? Which women generated the most revenue? Seasonal variations in demand. You weren't a person in their records. You were a profit center with detailed performance metrics. They knew your productivity better than they knew your name. The quota system was particularly cruel. Slower periods meant pressure to work longer hours, accept more clients, provide additional services without additional compensation. Temple officials would remind you that food and shelter weren't free, that you needed to justify the resources spent on keeping you alive. During busy festivals, you might service 20 or 30 men in a single day, your body becoming a mechanical process disconnected from any human emotion or dignity. The other women became your only allies, but even those relationships were complicated by competition and desperation. When food was scarce, when clients were few, when temple officials were looking for scapegoats for economic problems, friendships could turn into survival strategies. Information about wealthy clients, tips for avoiding violent ones, warnings about which officials were planning inspections. These became the currency of underground networks that kept women alive. But trust was dangerous too. A woman desperate enough might report another's minor infractions to curry favor with administrators. Someone might steal clients or spread rumors that damaged reputations. The system pit women against each other as surely as it pit them against the world outside temple walls. Solidarity was a luxury few could afford when survival required constant vigilance. The aging process was a countdown to obsolescence that haunted every woman in the system. Unlike craftsmen who became more valuable with experience, or scribes whose knowledge accumulated over decades, women in prostitution faced declining demand as they grew older. The temple's investment in housing and feeding them would eventually outweigh their earning potential, and everyone knew what happened then. Some temples maintained a separate class of older women who served as supervisors, managing younger prostitutes and handling administrative duties. But these positions were few and competitive. Most women simply disappeared from the records at some point, their fate unrecorded and unlamented. Whether they died of disease, were sold to lower status establishments, or were simply abandoned to fend for themselves in a society that offered them no legitimate means of survival, the records don't say. The medical realities were horrific, even by ancient standards. Sexually transmitted diseases spread rapidly through populations with no understanding of transmission or treatment. Women would develop painful infections that made work excruciating, but couldn't refuse clients without risking punishment. Pregnancy was both inevitable and catastrophic, with high mortality rates for both mothers and infants. Those who survived childbirth faced the choice of abandoning their children or raising them within the system that had trapped them. Contraception existed in primitive forms, herbal preparations and barrier methods that were unreliable and often dangerous. Some women resorted to deliberate injury or illness to avoid work. But temple officials learned to recognize these tactics and punish them severely. The desperate measures women took to control their own bodies revealed the depths of their powerlessness within the system. The religious justifications that supposedly elevated this work above common prostitution provided no practical protection or dignity. Yes, Inanna was associated with sexuality and fertility. Yes, there were mythological precedents for sacred unions, but these theological frameworks served the needs of the system's administrators rather than the women trapped within it. Religious language made exploitation seem divinely ordained rather than systemically cruel. When temple priests spoke of sacred duties and divine service, they weren't talking to the women providing these services. They were talking to clients who wanted their transactions sanctified, to city officials who needed the temple's economic contributions, to families who had sold daughters into the system and needed to believe they had served a higher purpose. The religious rhetoric was marketing, not theology. The broader political context made everything worse. As Mesopotamian city-states evolved into larger empires, central authorities gained greater control over local institutions, including temples. What might once have been small-scale local arrangements became standardized systems of exploitation operating across vast territories. Women lost even the minimal protections that might have come from personal relationships with local officials. Military campaigns brought special challenges. Conquering armies often targeted temple complexes for both their wealth and their symbolic importance. Women in these institutions faced rape, enslavement, or death, depending on the victor's policies toward defeated populations. Even friendly armies passing through a city could overwhelm local systems with sudden demand for services that institutions couldn't safely refuse. Economic fluctuations hit temple prostitutes harder than other workers. When harvests failed and food became scarce, their rations were cut first. When trade disruptions reduced temple income, they faced increased quotas to maintain revenue. When political instability threatened temple security, they were the most expendable members of the community. They absorbed the economic shocks that might otherwise destabilize the broader institution. The legal system's treatment of violence against prostitutes reveals society's complete devaluation of their lives. Assault charges required testimony that would never be believed from women of their status. Property damage claims might be filed if the violence affected their ability to work, but these protected the temple's economic interests rather than the women's physical safety. Murder investigations were perfunctory at best, with authorities more concerned about replacing lost revenue sources than punishing perpetrators. The isolation extended beyond social relationships to spiritual ones as well. While other temple workers participated in religious ceremonies and felt connected to divine purposes, women in prostitution were excluded from meaningful religious life. They served the goddess's earthly needs while being denied access to her spiritual community. Their sexuality was sacred enough to generate revenue but too polluted to permit worship. Cultural traditions that might have protected other vulnerable populations offered no help to temple prostitutes. Family honor systems that demanded protection for daughters and sisters didn't apply to women whose families had essentially disowned them through temple dedication. Tribal loyalties that provided mutual aid networks excluded women whose profession marked them as outcasts. Even criminal organizations that offered protection to other marginalized groups avoided association with temple prostitutes whose legal status made them untouchable. The geographical isolation of many temple complexes compounded their social isolation. Unlike urban prostitutes who might blend into city populations during off hours, temple workers were trapped within institutions that controlled every aspect of their daily existence. Leaving temple grounds required permission that was rarely granted. The surrounding communities viewed them with suspicion and hostility. There was literally nowhere to go and no one to turn to for help. Weather and natural disasters affected temple prostitutes disproportionately. During floods, they were housed in the lowest and most vulnerable parts of temple complexes. During famines, their food rations were reduced before those of more essential workers. During plagues, they continued working while other activities suspended, increasing their exposure to deadly diseases. They were expected to absorb risks that others were protected from. The administrative records that document their existence also reveal the complete commodification of their humanity. They were listed alongside livestock, grain stores, and bronze tools as temple assets. Their productivity was measured in the same terms as crop yields or craft production. When temples filed insurance claims for losses due to warfare or natural disasters, women were included in inventories of damaged property, rather than casualty lists of injured persons. International diplomacy sometimes involved exchanges of temple women between allied city-states, treating them as gifts that cemented political relationships. These transfers separated women from whatever minimal support networks they had developed, forcing them to adapt to new languages, customs, and administrative systems while maintaining the same degraded status. They were human currency in political transactions that treated their lives as completely disposable. The technological limitations of ancient medicine made their physical suffering constant and untreatable. Infection that modern antibiotics could cure in days became chronic conditions that plagued women for years. Injuries from violent clients healed improperly without surgical intervention. Mental health problems that we now recognize as treatable trauma responses were interpreted as moral failings or divine punishment. As the centuries passed and political systems evolved, the conditions for temple prostitutes generally worsened rather than improved. The increasing patriarchal control over women's sexuality that characterized later Mesopotamian periods created new restrictions and stigmas. What might have begun as religious practices with some cultural legitimacy gradually transformed into purely commercial enterprises with no pretense of sacred purpose. The women caught in this system weren't just victims of individual cruelty or personal misfortune. They were casualties of institutional structures that transformed human vulnerability into profit, while wrapping exploitation in religious language that made resistance seem not just futile, but sacrilegious. Their suffering was systematic, deliberate, and designed to be invisible to the very people who created and maintained the conditions that trapped them. And perhaps most tragically of all, this system worked exactly as intended. Temples generated enormous revenues. Families solved economic problems by transferring unwanted daughters to religious institutions. Officials maintained social order by providing outlets for male sexuality while controlling and stigmatizing the women who provided those services. The broader society benefited from the economic activity while remaining comfortable, distant from its human cost. The women themselves? They endured it all in silence, their voices lost to history, their stories buried beneath administrative records that reduced their lives to profit margins and productivity statistics. They were the invisible foundation upon which an entire civilization's sexual and economic arrangements rested, and tomorrow morning they would wake up and do it all again, because in the shadow of those ancient ziggurats, they had no choice at all. The record-keeping was meticulous in its dehumanization. Temple scribes maintained detailed logs that tracked every aspect of these women's lives with the cold precision of livestock inventory. How many clients per month? Which services generated the highest profits? Seasonal fluctuations in demand. They recorded menstrual cycles to predict availability, documented pregnancies that would temporarily reduce earning capacity, and noted illnesses that affected productivity. You weren't a human being in these ledgers. You were a revenue stream with maintenance costs. The quota systems were designed to extract maximum profit while keeping women alive just long enough to justify their upkeep. During slow periods, administrators would increase daily client requirements to maintain income levels. Festival seasons brought impossible demands. 20 or 30 men in a single day. Your body reduced to a mechanical process that had to continue regardless of pain, exhaustion, or injury. The mathematics were simple and brutal. Feed a woman enough to keep her functional, house her in the cheapest possible space, and extract every copper piece her body could generate. But the true genius of the system lay in how it made resistance psychologically impossible. Every aspect of daily life was designed to reinforce powerlessness. You woke when temple bells rang, ate what administrators provided, served whoever they assigned, and slept when your body finally collapsed from exhaustion. There were no choices, no personal preferences, no moments of autonomy that might remind you that you were once a human being with your own will. The other women around you were simultaneously your only allies and your greatest competition. Friendships formed out of desperation could shatter when resources became scarce. Someone might steal a client who paid well, or report another's minor infraction to curry favor with officials. Trust was a luxury that could cost you your life, but isolation meant facing the horror alone. You learned to navigate relationships where survival required constant calculation of loyalty versus self-preservation. The clients themselves revealed the full spectrum of human cruelty disguised as commerce. Some treated you like furniture, using your body while discussing business or politics as if you weren't present. Others wanted emotional intimacy that you couldn't provide, then became violent when your trained responses failed to satisfy their need for genuine affection. The religious pilgrims were often the worst, convinced they were participating in sacred rituals while inflicting trauma they believed was divinely sanctioned. There were the regulars who knew your name, your history, your fears, and used that knowledge as weapons. Local officials who'd visit monthly and expect you to remember their preferences, their complaints about wives, their business troubles. They'd share intimate details of their lives while treating you as less than human, pouring out their hearts to someone they'd ignore completely if they passed you in the market. The psychological manipulation was as damaging as the physical exploitation. The festival seasons brought their own special torments. While the city celebrated Inanna's divine sexuality with music, dancing, and joy, you experienced that same sexuality as degradation and violence. Pilgrims would arrive drunk on wine and religious fervor, convinced they were communing with the goddess through your body. Some would weep afterward, overcome by what they believed was spiritual transcendence. Others would become enraged when the reality failed to match their mystical expectations. The medical realities were a constant nightmare that ancient medicine couldn't address. Sexually transmitted diseases spread through temple populations like wildfire, causing painful infections that made work excruciating, but couldn't excuse you from quotas. Pregnancy was inevitable and catastrophic, with mortality rates that made childbirth a form of Russian roulette. Those who survived faced impossible choices about children who would either be abandoned or raised within the system that had destroyed their mothers. Contraception existed in primitive forms that were unreliable and often more dangerous than pregnancy itself. Herbal preparations that could cause sterility or death, barrier methods that provided little protection, desperate measures like deliberate injury or illness to avoid work. Temple officials learned to recognize these tactics and punish them with beatings, reduced rations, or assignment to the most violent clients as deterrent examples. The aging process was a countdown to obsolescence that haunted every woman in the system. Unlike craftsmen who became more valuable with experience, or scribes whose knowledge accumulated over decades, your worth decreased with every passing year. The temple's investment in housing and feeding you would eventually outweigh your earning potential, and everyone knew what happened then. Some establishments maintained positions for older women as supervisors or administrators, but these roles were rare and competitive. Most simply disappeared from the records at some point, their fate unrecorded and unlamented. The religious justifications that supposedly elevated this work above common prostitution provided no practical protection or dignity. Temple priests would speak eloquently about sacred duties and divine service, but they weren't addressing the women providing these services. They were marketing to clients who wanted their transactions sanctified, to city officials who needed the temple's economic contributions, to families who had sold daughters into the system and required theological comfort for their decisions. When administrators invoked Inanna's mythology to justify the institution, they carefully omitted the parts of those stories where the goddess wielded power, made choices, and controlled her own destiny. The religious rhetoric served everyone except the women supposedly honored by it. You were sacred enough to generate revenue, but too polluted to participate in actual worship. Your sexuality was divinely blessed when it produced income, but morally contaminated when you tried to claim basic human dignity. The broader political context made everything worse as Mesopotamian city-states evolved into larger empires. What might once have been small-scale local arrangements became standardized systems of exploitation operating across vast territories. Central authorities gained greater control over temple operations, removing even the minimal protections that might have come from personal relationships with local officials. You became a cog in an imperial machine rather than a person known to your community. Military campaigns brought special terrors that went beyond normal exploitation. Conquering armies often targeted temple complexes for both their wealth and symbolic importance. Women in these institutions faced rape, enslavement, or death depending on the victor's policies toward defeated populations. Even allied armies passing through could overwhelm local systems with demands that temples couldn't safely refuse. You absorbed the violence of political conflicts that had nothing to do with your choices or actions. Economic fluctuations hit temple prostitutes harder than any other workers. When harvests failed and food became scarce, your rations were cut first. When trade disruptions reduced temple income, your quotas increased to maintain revenue. When political instability threatened institutional security, you were the most expendable member of the community. You absorbed economic shocks that might otherwise destabilize the broader system, your body serving as a buffer against forces completely beyond your control. The legal system's treatment of violence against prostitutes revealed society's complete devaluation of your life. Assault charges required testimony that would never be believed from women of your status. Property damage claims might be filed if violence affected your ability to work, but these protected the temple's economic interests rather than your physical safety. Murder investigations were perfunctory at best, with authorities more concerned about replacing lost revenue sources than punishing perpetrators. Cultural traditions that protected other vulnerable populations offered no help whatsoever. Family honor systems that demanded protection for daughters and sisters didn't apply to women whose families had essentially disowned them through temple dedication. Tribal loyalties that provided mutual aid networks excluded women whose profession marked them as outcasts. Even criminal organizations that offered protection to other marginalized groups avoided association with temple prostitutes whose legal status made them untouchable. The geographical isolation of temple complexes compounded social isolation in ways that made escape impossible even to imagine. Unlike urban prostitutes who might blend into city populations during off hours, you were trapped within institutions that controlled every aspect of daily existence. Leaving temple grounds required permissions that were rarely granted. Surrounding communities viewed you with suspicion and hostility. There was literally nowhere to go and no one to turn to for help. Weather and natural disasters affected you disproportionately because your welfare was always the lowest priority. During floods, you were housed in the most vulnerable parts of temple complexes. During famines, your food rations were reduced before those of essential workers. During plagues, you continued working while other activities suspended, increasing exposure to deadly diseases. You were expected to absorb risks that others were protected from, your life considered less valuable than temple property or livestock. The administrative records that documented your existence also revealed the complete commodification of your humanity. You were listed alongside livestock, grain stores, and bronze tools as temple assets. Your productivity was measured in the same terms as crop yields or craft production. When temples filed claims for losses due to warfare or natural disasters, you were included in inventories of damaged property, rather than casualty lists of injured persons. International diplomacy sometimes involved exchanges of temple women between allied city-states, treating you as gifts that cemented political relationships. These transfers separated you from whatever minimal support networks you had developed, forcing adaptation to new languages, customs, and administrative systems while maintaining the same degraded status. You were human currency in political transactions that treated your life as completely disposable. The technological limitations of ancient medicine made physical suffering constant and untreatable. Infections that modern antibiotics could cure in days became chronic conditions that plagued you for years. Injuries from violent clients healed improperly without surgical intervention. Mental health problems that we now recognize as treatable trauma responses were interpreted as moral failings or divine punishment, requiring additional hardship rather than care. As centuries passed and political systems evolved, conditions generally worsened rather than improved. The increasing patriarchal control over women's sexuality that characterized later Mesopotamian periods created new restrictions and stigmas. What might have begun as religious practices with some cultural legitimacy gradually transformed into purely commercial enterprises with no pretense of sacred purpose. The religious window dressing became thinner, while the exploitation intensified. The women caught in this system weren't just victims of individual cruelty or personal misfortune, they were casualties of institutional structures that transformed human vulnerability into profit while wrapping exploitation in religious language that made resistance seem not just futile but sacrilegious. Their suffering was systematic, deliberate, and designed to be invisible to the very people who created and maintained the conditions that trapped them. Perhaps most tragically, this system worked exactly as intended by everyone except the women within it. Temples generated enormous revenues that funded construction projects, maintained large bureaucracies, and supported the political ambitions of city-states. Families solved economic problems by transferring unwanted daughters to religious institutions that provided them with theological justification for abandonment. Officials maintained social order by providing outlets for male sexuality while controlling and stigmatizing the women who provided those services. The broader society benefited from the economic activity while remaining comfortably distant from its human cost. Citizens could visit temples for legitimate religious purposes while ignoring the exploitation happening in back rooms. Merchants could conduct business with institutions whose wealth partly derived from human trafficking while focusing only on profitable transactions. Politicians could tout temple contributions to civic projects while overlooking the source of those contributions. And the women themselves endured it all in silence, their voices lost to history, their stories buried beneath administrative records that reduced their lives to profit margins and productivity statistics. They were the invisible foundation upon which an entire civilization's sexual and economic arrangements rested. Tomorrow morning, they would wake up and face it all again, because in the shadow of those ancient ziggurats, they had no choice at all. The seasonal cycles brought predictable variations in their misery that followed the agricultural calendar and religious festivals. Spring fertility celebrations meant increased demand from pilgrims, convinced they were participating in sacred renewal rituals. Summer heat made cramped temple rooms unbearable, while quotas remained unchanged. Autumn harvests brought merchants with temporary wealth and permanent entitlement. Winter cold meant reduced heating for the least important members of temple communities, while work continued regardless of comfort. Each season carried its own specific torments wrapped in religious significance that made suffering seem divinely ordained rather than systematically imposed. The women experienced these cycles not as natural rhythms, but as recurring waves of intensified exploitation that followed patterns they couldn't escape or predict with enough accuracy to prepare for mentally. So there it is, the reality behind the myths, the human cost hidden beneath religious rhetoric, the systematic exploitation that masqueraded as divine service. These weren't empowered priestesses celebrating sacred sexuality. They were women trapped in an institution that commodified their bodies while society looked away. Their stories, lost to administrative records and bureaucratic ledgers, remind us that behind every ancient civilization's grandeur lay invisible suffering that made it all possible. Next time you see those majestic ziggurats in history books, remember the women who paid the price for their construction in the shadows of temple walls.